And it's a great pleasure to be here to speak to you at this conference as a representative, or as you can see, a former representative of one of the participating organizations, the Association Européenne des Conservatoires, Académies de Musique et Musisikhochschulen. Needs a long breath to get all of that out, but it's a very important universal encapsulation of all the different types of higher music education that take place in Europe. We find AEC a much more manageable mouthful when talking about these things. We've had, I should explain the former briefly. I took my retirement from this post this summer. I'm now working full-time on finishing a book that so far has been about 40 years in the gestation. The target is to give myself about another 18 months and finally get it out. So it's nice from that rather solitary experience that I've been enjoying, if that's the right word, for the last few months, to come back in a gathering of some very good friends and colleagues, and also colleagues from the discipline. We've had a tremendous amount of information of very high quality that we've already been given about this whole question of striving for excellence. I want to take an approach which does look very much at it from the perspective of the discipline with which I've been involved, higher music education. Lucien spoke earlier about these eccentric arts people who are all very chaotic and everything. And I know that your tongue was firmly in your cheek when you said that, Lucien. It's true, though, that we are rather different from other types of teaching. And yet, as the PHExcel project itself has shown, by taking a group of quite disparate disciplines in this so-called professional higher education sector, I think we've learned a lot from each other, and it reinforces the idea that we have a lot to learn from each other. So I shall be talking about the bigger picture, but through the lens of my own discipline, and that's why I've adapted the title of this conference as a whole, Striving for Excellence, as you see, to this rather musical idea of striving for a perfect ensemble. And I want to use the metaphor, drive it in different ways, to try and explore some of the aspects of how we might achieve the sort of excellence that we're talking about. So, first of all, I'm starting with a key extract from the draft quality framework for professional higher education excellence. Here it is, and I'll read it out to you. Professional higher education, or PHE, is a form of higher education that offers a particularly intense integration with the world of work. The statement goes on, but that's the phrase that I'm really going to focus on, this particularly intense integration with the world of work. And the second paragraph says, an understanding of excellence specific to PHE must by definition be based on the cornerstone of its intense integration with the world of work. So this is clearly something very important, and therefore I think worth doing more than just using the phrase and then passing on. We really have to stop and reflect on what this particularly intense integration might be. As it says, it's important to understand what the phrase means. So clearly it implies in some kind of way that these separate two, these binary, or you might argue multiple entities of higher education on the one side and the world of work on the other should act as one, should be intensely integrated. And now in music, we might speak of this integration in terms of ensemble. This word, ensemble, designates both a group of musicians, so an orchestra is a particular type of ensemble, so is a string quartet, etc., etc. So it might denote the group, but it also is used to describe the quality of closely coordinated precision with which they aspire to play. When an ensemble plays in a particularly tight together way, we say that's a good ensemble. So, this phrase that I've used in my title, a perfect ensemble, I think my idea of this is it refers primarily to this second meaning, to the idea of the separate elements being fused into an inseparable whole. Now, if we think of this, this means that the perfect ensemble implies a coming together not just in space, that it occupies the same platform, but in time. It acts in the same moment, in fact in the same nanosecond, in the highest quality of musical performance. Now, it seems to me that the same needs to be true if an intense integration between professional higher education and the world of work is to achieve excellence. The reality, I feel, is that those coming from both sides may indeed work closely together, but, and I'm using my experience from my discipline here, they often have conceptions of one another that are seriously outdated. Now, obviously, I'm going to be looking, therefore, at how this conception or misconception arises, what is the consequences of it, and what strategies we might use to overcome this. And I'll be dealing with higher music education, which therefore means, in part, I shall be being quite critical of my own discipline. But I don't believe that we're so unusual in this respect, and I hope that you will agree with me. There is a wider applicability, I think, to some of the concerns which I'm going to voice. And that broader relevance was very happily shown for me. You may have seen this article in just last week's Times Higher Education. The results of the 6th Annual Global Employability University Survey. And there were several aspects of this article which I found very useful as I was mulling over aspects of my presentation. Here's an important thing that's shown. Recruiters across the world attach more importance to having favourable past experience of a university's graduates than they do to graduates' expertise in the field of competence for which they're applying. In fact, competence in the field for which they're applying is only the 3rd most important criterion. You can see from the percentages between the 1st and 3rd that they're not necessarily terribly huge, but the 1st and most important thing is past experience, and it's only the 3rd most important to come and say, well, can they really do what the field is about? So in other words, with a bit of caricature or exaggeration, recruiters are primarily making decisions in the present that affect consequences in the future, the ongoing vitality of their professional field, based on knowledge acquired in the past. Now, in the field of higher music education, and doubtless elsewhere, this phenomenon, I think, is kind of obscured. We're not so aware of it because all the time we're interacting. We see each other across both sides a lot. So we think, yeah, of course we must know what the current thing is in some kind of way. So what you might think of as a benefit that we are in this close interaction can be a sort of smokescreen or something like that, make complacency. I'll give an example. We depend in higher music education very much on our expert instrumental and vocal teachers. They are high-level practitioners who come into the conservatoires to teach, often on a one-to-one basis with the students. Now, they mostly are combining teaching and professional activity, so they live with an intense mixture of these two things. And in fact, a typical working day for such a teacher might mean that they'll come in, do a few hours teaching, then go to a rehearsal, do a concert in the evening, etc. The interaction is incredibly intense and blended and fused between the two. But partly because they're making this constant and busy interchange, they don't really have the time to explore either of these two worlds, the world of higher education and the world of work, beyond the very narrow confines of what they do. They are very expert in those two areas, but they don't have the opportunity really either to experience or to reflect on what's the situation more widely, either in the institution where they come in, grab a key, go to a room, teach their students, return the key, go back out, or the rehearsal where they sit at the desk with the music that they've just run through the previous night, rehearse, go to the concert, go away. I will allow myself one anecdote. At my former institution, the Royal College of Music here in London, we started around about 2000, a day each year where we encouraged our staff, which in the case of hourly paid staff meant paying them, to come together for a sort of development day together. I was standing welcoming them at the door, and 2 of our teachers came in the room. They happened to both play in the same orchestra. And they greeted one another, and one said to the other, "Oh, I didn't know you taught at the Royal College of Music." That's the level of deep but absolutely circumscribed knowledge and familiarity that they have. So let's think about the leaders. Well, they tend to be either more unequivocally in one world or the other. In their own world, they have very deep, very nuanced, very extensive knowledge of what's going on. But again, often they don't have the time or space to achieve anything like this level of sophistication in their understanding of the other side. And in fact, in many cases, they will have had greater previous than present exposure to this other side, dating from a time when they too were either in higher education or starting their careers. So this can be a hindrance rather than a help. They still feel knowledgeable. They lived in both these worlds. They think they know them. But they could be therefore unaware that their knowledge base is becoming outdated. Now, this syndrome might be called, or I am calling it, the professional parallax. A tendency to see across the professional divide. Yes, I'm seeing, it's fine, but in a distorted way, with the distorting lens being, in this case, time-based rather than an optical distortion. And I'd like to make a little diagram of this. So you'll see on the left there the present situation where each side is having its conception of the other. On the other side, the knowledge base on which they're founding that. There's the perceived evidence, but I would suggest the actual evidence is here, and that is the professional parallax. Now, we've heard a lot today about change and accelerating change. The more that change accelerates, both in higher education and in the professional environment, the more this professional parallax becomes an impediment to excellence. Perceptions can become outdated in years or even months, rather than the decades that it might have taken for things to shift before. So updating needs to become an almost constant exercise, and the dangers of not updating become greater. So, how can the effects of this professional parallax be mitigated? Well, I think the first step is to recognize the phenomenon. We have to wake up to the fact that we, in some respects, are kidding ourselves. And once we've done that, then perhaps we can move forward. Now, I think the fundamental way of doing this, and again we've heard this expressed in a number of different ways this afternoon, is to ensure the mobilization of all groups. And thinking obviously from the higher education side, the leaders within the institution, the teachers, but also, and perhaps most importantly, the students are to be engaged in this exercise. And as I say, this chimes with much of what we've heard this afternoon. I'd like to take each category in turn. Leaders. Again, the situation becomes more difficult. The modernization agenda in higher education as itself means you have to professionalize yourself as a higher education expert. In the olden days, it was very common for distinguished composers or performers to be the leaders of conservatoires, to combine those two areas. Now it's much harder. In fact, it's becoming increasingly difficult, I would say, for leaders in conservatoires to maintain their professional profile in their own field and be effective and competent leaders. So to compensate, they have to do a number of things. I think that they have to set very clear institutional priorities, and we've heard a lot about mission and vision. We've heard a lot about culture. This is what I'm talking about too. They have to emphasize to their institution the importance that they attach to a close and up-to-date understanding of the professional world. They should be prepared to invest in giving staff time for the upkeep of contacts. And I've already alluded to the fact that it's quite common for staff in conservatoires to be hourly paid rather than salaried. And so that, when I say invest in giving more time, I mean invest in a very direct sense, finding money and funds for them to do more than just be paid for their contact teaching. And of course, there are strategic partnerships. I'm not necessarily thinking solely about those within the Erasmus Plus program of the European Commission, but certainly there, this emphasis on creating partnerships that bridge the higher education professional world is something that's very prominent. So there are ways that funds can potentially be accessed to do this. For the teachers, well, Teachers need to be encouraged to take on wider responsibilities than those of just delivering lessons. They need to be engaged with curriculum development. We've seen how important a role in Danuta's presentation, so beautifully presented on her behalf, how important this question of curriculum development is, and quality enhancement as well. We need to have all the teachers involved in that. And they need to think critically about all of the learning and teaching processes in which they are involved. And as I've already said, if this is to happen, contractual arrangements for teachers need to reflect this broader commitment. But even here, there's a danger. If we ask them, in effect, to spend more time in the institution, to be thinking more and more widely about what's going in the institution, what may suffer? It may be the breadth and depth of their knowledge in the profession. So we have to really be careful and balance between these two. Now, what about the students? There is still a tendency, and I'm glad from some of the things that were said earlier that we're not unique in this. We still think, there was a wonderful image of the garden, the fenced garden into which the professor leads the students. I think that fits very much with higher music education still in many respects. So the students receive the accumulated wisdom of their teachers and are to some extent passive, therefore. And again, I think, Lucien, you were talking about the idea that people say, yes, we're doing student-centered learning, and then you say, well, what does that mean? And then there's a sort of big question mark that hangs in the air. We've talked a lot about it for a long time, but I think it's time to get real about what we really mean by student-centered learning and the consequences of understanding that. Now, music students actually often embody a more complete integration of the contemporary realities of higher education on the one side and the world of work on the other than their teachers. They are making their way in both simultaneously as they engage in their higher education. So true student-centered learning plus, and this is starting to come, but there's still a lot of work to be done here, having the active presence of students on committees, in curriculum development groups, etc., 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 is terribly important because they see the most contemporary vision of what's going on in higher education and what's going on in the profession as well. So driven by this collective mobilization, the ways in which curriculum design can contribute to professional integration will of course need to be kept under constant review. And again, we've talked about the dynamic quality of excellence, but the intense integration itself is a dynamic issue. It can't ever be regarded as achieved. It's something that has to be worked at, kept under constant review. Again, quoting from this same article last week, the chief executive of the UK's National Centre for Universities and Businesses said in the article, was quoted as saying, that universities need to be more sophisticated and contemporary when designing degrees and must move beyond sandwich courses, traditional placements, etc. Now, in fact, higher music education actually has quite a good record in devising innovative integration models. Rather than segregating periods of study in the institution and work experience in the world of work, conservatoires have traditionally adopted a more blended approach, and as they have modernized, the variety of activities in that blended approach has itself enriched. So they may interact with current professionals in a whole variety of ways. The first, of course, is that for all the difficulties that I've already described around this, the fact they have a main one-to-one teacher who's almost certainly still an active professional is a fantastic resource they have. They will be being taught, but they're also talking with their teacher. The teacher is providing them with networks and contacts, etc., etc., etc. So, in a sense, you could say the lesson itself is an example of a blending of higher education and the profession. There are lots of project-based interactions, and more of these are coming. There was a time, certainly in this country, where unionization of the professional music business produced some impediments, because you might have the lovely idea of putting students and professionals together in a public concert, but then the argument comes, well, if you've got a student playing, you're not paying a professional to sit in that seat. There's been a great deal more flexibility about that. And there was an example, again, with my former institution where a major work of the 20th century, a piece by composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen that requires 3 separate orchestras, was put on at the South Bank Centre here in London only by the possibility of combining professionals with students in the enlarged triple orchestra. So fantastic opportunity there for the students. Many of the conservatoires invite guest professional conductors to come in to conduct the orchestras. So those people have certain expectations about professional conduct and behaviour, which if they don't find that matched by the student orchestra, next time they're asked, they won't come. There's a real professional discipline incorporated, therefore, through that kind of experience. And increasingly, there are ways in which orchestras, even if they don't allow students to perform in concerts, will allow them into rehearsals with their conductors in a side-by-side situation. So they're getting kind of mentoring within this kind of process. That's only a handful of examples, and sometimes the integration goes even deeper. There are very close links, for example, between the Guildhall School of Music and Drama here in London and the Barbican Centre, with which it is physically adjacent. They've made it also culturally adjacent and integrated in the way that they work together. And if I can put in a little plug for my association, I would say that the AEC itself has been prominent in sharing information and experience about these kinds of patterns of engagement and how they can enhance quality. So we share good practice across the European space about this. But even if implementing all of this takes us closer towards this perfect ensemble, the final point to remember is that such unanimity and precision may be necessary for excellence, but it's not sufficient. Staying with the musical metaphor, musicians need more than a mechanical perfection. They must draw upon empathy, emotional intelligence, a lightning-fast adaptability if they're to turn this perfect coordination into an intensely musical integration. Well, now, by analogy, professional excellence implies not just creating a perfect match between the curriculum and current professional needs, but also building in future-proofing through the development of broader skills, skills like critical thinking, flexibility, creativity. Again, we've heard about this. And again, the Times Higher Education article is relevant. It quotes the Vice President and Provost of the University of Toronto as saying, what we understood from employers is that skills help students get an initial job, but creativity, critical thinking, analysis, and a broad knowledge base contribute to a successful career. Now, recent trends in conservatoire training reflect a growing realization of the crucial nature of such wider transverse or transferable competencies, even in an apparently closed and specialized profession such as music. Now, this doesn't mean we don't need a close and up-to-date understanding between HE and the world of work, just that we need more than this. In a sense, what we need is not just to narrow the outdatedness embodied in the professional parallax, but to reverse it. By examining the present situation, we need to extrapolate, insofar as this is possible, of course, to that which will operate in the future. We need a kind of prospective professional parallax for things to work. All this raises the question, which I feel I need to put, as to whether there truly is a meaningfully distinct brand of excellence associated with professional higher education compared with higher education as a whole. And indeed, that has been a debate that has been a characteristic throughout the 2 years of the PHExcel project itself. On the one hand, employment imperatives, as we've seen, are increasingly important for the whole sector. And the wonderful presentation about TEF shows how they may very well form one indicator, employment statistics. And the very existence of the Global Employability University Survey shows this as well. And then on the other, as I've suggested, transverse skills such as creativity, critical thinking, analysis, and a broad knowledge base seem as relevant to professional higher education as to higher education in general. In fact, this is acknowledged in the document, the draft quality framework. It says, a sense of professional value, is about integrating professional aspirations and ethos with those of knowledge acquisition and self-growth applicable to any learner group. Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And it goes on to say, learners assimilate these through their learning and through their realization that the professional world is in both the classroom and the placement, i.e. that they are learning for a profession, but also learning in a profession. And one of the things we used to say to students at the Royal College of Music when they came is, from this moment, you are in the profession. So this last statement connects with the call in the Times Higher Education article, I think, for a more sophisticated and contemporary approach to models of integration, not just the work placement, etc., etc. And maybe it might be a better litmus test than this mantra of intense integration for excellence in professional higher education, that sense of truly being in the world of work from the moment one starts within the professional higher education. Ultimately, I think the value of the PHExcel project, and I think it has about excellence across HE than its identification of any individual convincing model for a distinctive professional higher education excellence.